Hello game developer, new and veteran alike. This message is for you. I want to impart some considerations and guidelines from my perspective as a player and fellow observer and participant of society that I think will make for a healthier and more fulfilling gaming culture for all involved. Developing as rapidly as we are with our technology, it can be easy to let certain principles and states of mind fall by the wayside as we rush from one thing to the next, causing us all to be swept into a place of misunderstanding with our fellow humankind, or to lose sight of our original goals and intentions for why we venture on the paths we do to share our creativity with one another. Gaming is now a mainstream form of social entertainment that can be as affecting and influential as any other medium that we use to share worlds with one another. Possibly even more so, owing to the unique interactive nature that gaming offers its participants. You probably know this already though, and just want to make a good or cool game. Fair enough, of course, but I would stop you for a moment to consider this one idea. That to be a developer creating what may be a culturally influential game is akin to that of a parent who needs to carefully consider the impression they make and the challenges they create for the generations looking toward them for experiences to learn from. A parent who hopefully wishes to see those generations surpass themselves in time. And so, with that thought now planted, please hear my reasons and guidance to support this. First, be aware of the potentially enormous effects your creation could have on cultures and the lives within them, and understand the responsibility this entails. One of the most powerful and consistently observed habits of human behavior throughout recorded history is that of our inclination to tell stories and create narratives. We seem to be very deeply affected and motivated by the tales we weave, no matter the medium of delivery. People place so much heart, meaning, and identity in our stories. We are ravenous for them. They can act very much as a guiding wind with which we may use to help orient ourselves somewhat through the directionless mess that life can often be. Your game has the potential to hold this very same power. Even if there is no direct story or narrative involved, just the context and interactivity in and of itself can be affecting in ways, especially now that we have the internet to share it worldwide. Be aware that the world, narrative, context, and everything within those boundaries that you help create may inspire people's imaginations in innumerable ways, allow them to learn and experiment with new skills that can translate into everyday real-life benefits, create meaningful communities with all the lessons and practices that come with social interactions, allow exploration and interaction with thoughts and ideas that can cause them to move toward a path of more open and complex thinking, teach life lessons and principles. As with any communicative and interactive-based medium, a game very seriously has the potential to make its players, your fellow human brothers and sisters all around you, more competent and capable individuals toward dealing with the challenges of actual real life and themselves. But I must mention, before the gravity of these words begin to feel overly weighty on you, the knowledge and awareness of this power is not good reason for suppression or censorship of your premise, narratively or mechanically, through fear of any twisted consequences that will always have a small possibility of arising when filtered through endlessly different lenses of perception. Such consequences would not be your fault, but rather an issue with the individual's processing of what they receive. To have to restrict, dilute, dumb down your work, and thus so the healthy majority of those who would receive it, out of fear of the maladjusted minority, only further enables a continuation of that fear to permeate through our creative expressions and ultimately constricting our collective capabilities for thinking, growth of thought, and mental acuity. We never improve through avoidance of things that challenge us. Do not squander this power. If you take adequate care and responsibility, your creation and its experience can bring joy and meaning to a life, and may allow them to come out of it the other side as a more capable and fulfilled individual, ready and able to take on more complex challenges, keeping us all growing as a result, so long as you do not let fear of challenge cripple your creation, and that you do not try to artificially curate the results. You provide the tools, context, and adequate knowledge to get us all started, then let nature take its course. And it shall. We will arrange ourselves accordingly to overcome the challenges if left enough to our devices, even if we complain and struggle at first, as humans usually do. We always overcome eventually, and are always stronger for it. Have faith and trust. Which brings me to point number 2. You, as a game creator, and those intimately involved with its development, ultimately should know what is best for your game, and you must communicate that intent to the players properly to minimize mismatched expectations and frustrations, and prevent yourselves from being pressured by others into making bad long-term decisions. Be as clear as you can about what kind of experience you've set out to make, and the level of interactivity you want to provide within it. This is very important because communication between parties across the world is now incredibly easy and frequent, so there is no good excuse for this lack of effort beyond your own complacency. That being said, the present ease of communication between us is a double-edged sword, because it has led general conversation down an unfortunate route of laziness, carelessness, frequent hyperbole, and outright mistruth as a commonplace when using online text-based methods, egged on by growing cultural disdains for detail, care, and attentiveness in one's words, as if doing so is somehow being pretentious and wasteful in instant messaging. The disregarding and societal rejection of these considerations has seeded some very unhealthy habits. At present, as this situation remains, I would strongly advise against taking, considering, or even relying upon feedback from the general player base. That's right, I'm saying we players should have very minimal to zero direct input toward the state of a game. Until our cultures begin to properly relearn and use our pre-established communication methods and etiquette within the internet and written sphere, and remember once again why it's necessary to pay attention to the details of writing, and why echo chambers should be discouraged, not encouraged, then our ability to think and process through this medium will remain compromised and untrustworthy. The average player, when giving feedback and suggestions on the experience, will usually do so caring only for their own personal needs and preferences for how the game might change to satiate their whimsical emotion of the moment, regardless of whether this feedback is in any way fitting for your game experience. No thought will usually go into this, especially for the long term. This is compounded further by the careless and defensive manner in which we are more frequently communicating, encouraging erratic and closed attitudes towards any healthy discussion that may otherwise challenge or develop on those ideas and suggestions. Now you may think this is okay. You may instead simply gather their words en masse as collective data and average it out to form a bigger picture of reliable feedback that you can react to. But we must factor in that players are seldom considering the big picture of the game's identity, and may not be self-aware of their own fallacies, let alone be willing to admit or concede on them. There are enormous future ramifications that may develop over time from a seemingly innocuous adjustment which appears fairly harmless on the surface, but can change the entire identity of how your game is perceived and interacted with in a fundamental manner, contradictory to your intended goal. Let's take the Battlefield series as an example of how one tiny, seemingly harmless change of convenience eventually led to the destruction of the entire game's integrity and identity. That change, among others that followed as a result, was allowing infinite stamina for sprinting. The Battlefield series originally identified as a heavily team-based large-scale warfare game. There were defined roles the player could play as to support their team: medic, engineer, support, assault, commander, etc. And the game allowed for multiple modes of transport and vehicular combat via land, sea, and air. Success per match was mostly determined by your ability to support one another effectively, pay attention to and understand the needs of your team around you as you fight for the objectives. Having people willing to act as gunners and repair your vehicle, medics to revive and heal the wounded, support to resupply ammunition, the commander to provide vital intel on enemy movements and other support. Overall gameplay and movement could by no means be considered very realistic, with many aspects leaning toward a more arcadey feel of responsiveness, but there was a clear set of limitations placed on each player that facilitated a need of dependence on your teammates' support in order to succeed in both your individual battles and the war itself. Up to Battlefield 2, one of these limitations was a limited but constantly recharging stamina bar for actions such as sprinting and jumping. Now why was this a feature, you may ask? The most immediate and obvious reason one can surmise would be that it helped dictate the pacing and flow of on-foot movement and combat, which the developers would have had a certain idea for, that matched with their ultimate vision of the play experience. Speed of movement itself is a very strong definer of the feeling one has toward an action, and thus the feeling of gameplay. That much is clear. But overall movement capabilities of a player can also define other aspects of a game, such as map design and size, which must usually factor in the speed and options for player traversal and be adjusted, or not, in balance with providing opportunities while also reinforcing the game's identity and expectations. Movement may also determine combat flow and how the tools used by the player perform based upon the mobility options available, and so on. In the case of Battlefield's original and observably clear identity, there were a few more nuanced elements at play to help support its goal by limiting the player's movement. First, limited bursts of faster speed requires the player to be more thoughtful about their movement on foot. If stamina is poorly managed, they may find themselves in an open and vulnerable position and more likely to be attacked. More crucially, the player must also think about where they want to go before they go there, rather than running around mindlessly on reaction from fight to fight. This promoted a more deliberate awareness and planning of what they wanted to do. As such, the gameplay flow slows to something more in line with the expectation of a team-based military-style shooter. This awareness and vulnerability, and thinking more of where one should go, also promoted another behavior: moving and communicating with your team. Where we are more likely to be vulnerable as an individual, we feel safer in numbers. Thus, this limitation further encouraged team behavior that better matches the game's intended gameplay, which had a knock-on supporting effect for the other core game mechanics, such as being around to help one another with the tools of their class. This limitation also worked in favor of supporting yet another core feature: vehicle usage. With the limitation of one's on-foot movement, coupled with the intentional large sizes of many maps to set an appropriate scale for an ongoing war, vehicles were a much more attractive prospect for players. Many could get you to the place you planned to go much faster, could provide protection from attack, carry multiple team members, offer defensive capabilities such as a gunner seat, and allow traversing differing terrains, offering unique aspects to each mode of transport. Strengthened more so if the team actively worked together to overcome the vehicle's disadvantages of being a larger, more noticeable target by maintaining that vehicle, resupplying it, defending it, acting as spotters for hostile forces, all creating a vital sense of team unity and dependence that fosters the intended gameplay experience further. Players often wouldn't consciously consider all these factors, they just did them naturally through innate awareness of their limitations and understanding of the tools provided to them. Those limitations naturally guided them, as we are always inclined as social beings. The game was clear in what it wanted to be, and the players responded to that challenge, not with demoralization and defeat at the prospect of having to work a bit more, but with their innate natural adaptation to work with one another to understand, overcome, and succeed, as we always do if left to our devices with the appropriate tools. Now, let's look at the preceding titles after Battlefield 2, where the series started to see the introduction of unlimited sprint. What happened? Well, at first, not very much on the surface. The series' established identity was still fairly distinct, and while some design changes did start to creep in, such as reduced map sizes or closer distances between objectives, the overall player approach still leaned more toward multi-role, team-based play in order to succeed. However, this change planted a seed in the player's psychology, communicating a slightly different message to us about the game and how it should be naturally approached. A small mismatch began to emerge in the gameplay flow, and thus in the player's mind. Eventually, as time goes on, the now less restricted flow of movement speed sees players begin to move around the map less so as a team, as the feeling of vulnerability reduces owing to the consequence-free access to a faster pace through dangerous areas. As a result, there is less incentive to both consider more carefully your movements and to stay together with your teammates to feel less vulnerable. The player feels more individually empowered and thus engages in a more solo-minded approach. Vehicles begin to seem less attractive to this player now, because even though they would get to the objectives much faster using them, the infinite sprint created enough feeling of adequately fast pacing to tolerate the extra travel time. Plus, they are more inconspicuous on foot compared to a vehicle. This then further seeds the thought that having to find a vehicle, hope for or request a gunner and passengers, or have to ask for transport from others with no guarantee, to be a bigger and more obvious target that is potentially defenseless without teammates is a less desirable, more complex and time-consuming option compared to sprinting. This mindset proliferates more over time within the player base. They start publicly bemoaning the boring and wasteful travel time between the action. The developers then look at their data for player behavior and note that more players are favoring traversal on foot. In order to then satisfy the seemingly organic shifting trend in player behavior, the next game is designed with smaller maps with less distance between the objectives and with less necessity for vehicle usage. But then players start expressing publicly how there is, for whatever reason, less teamwork happening during play. Medics not paying so much attention to heal and revive, support players not providing ammunition as much, mechanics not caring so much to repair, all of which is a very logical side effect of empowering movement and shortening travel distance, as there is even more focus on individual performance rather than team play, because the consequences of failure are even more lessened as a result. It takes less time to travel back to the action, meaning action happens at a faster pace and more frequently, meaning less situations of depleted resources, meaning less need for team support and communication, and a gameplay cycle where killing the enemy starts becoming the greatest factor of reward. Further condemned by the decision to now have regenerating health on top of this. The developers look at their numbers on a screen, and they do indeed note less teamwork happening as is complained about. What to do? So, they address the complaints by increasing extrinsic teamwork rewards without consideration for the deeper intrinsic motivations that encourage this behavior to begin with. It doesn't seem to work though. Players continue disregarding each other, more so against the design goal of the game. Well, in that case, let's make the team-based mechanics much more streamlined and convenient so that teamwork can happen indirectly, without disrupting the current flow that players want. Well, let players drop supply or heal stations that provide to others within a proximity without the need to actually be there. And as for vehicles, we'll let them self-repair after some time. Great. And so that's what the developers did. But what's this? Communication between teammates declines further due to even less need for one another's support. The core identity of the game's teamwork-based aspect now begins to turn against itself. Teammates become a hindrance, a frustration to one's desire to get into the action faster and faster, as the game's movement and flow seems to want them to do so quicker and quicker. Teammates are not to be depended on now, and only function as a distraction, bullet catcher, or safe zone indicator for a location, with the occasional supply box here and there. Players feel the game's movement and map design wants them to play in a certain way, but these other mechanics seem to only pointlessly disrupt their flow. So they complain. The game feels off, in conflict with itself. The players voice their ideas for how the game should be. Exasperated, the developers read their words, look at the data, and concede. Times are changing, I suppose. I don't get what's happened, but we must adapt to the players' needs, they say to themselves. The next game's maps are ever smaller and simpler. More team-based features get automated, simplified, or removed. Time to kill and weapon recoil get severely reduced to be like laser guns in order to compensate for the relentless speed of which the players are now constantly moving around. Objectives start being placed in straight lines or in a small circle from one another so as to keep the flow and relentless action the players so desperately seem to seek. The pacing is sped up all the more. The class distinctions become only about serving oneself rather than the team. Respawns become near instant and close to the action all the time. Vehicles become nothing but a temporary power-up or spectacle to offer a few free kills. The whole game's identity collapses, but the players have now become impatient and entitled, having their impulsive surface needs become the main focus, justified with no thought otherwise, the actual game itself now becomes a confused shell of an experience that is lackluster and as shallow as the surface impulse, frequently contradicting itself, while constantly and obviously artificially manufacturing outcomes with its spawn systems to keep that fickle, one-dimensional impulse fed, ultimately leaving no one truly satisfied. Interest wanes, the game fails. Developers did nothing but listen to the players, yet the ungrateful players still aren't happy. Bitter developers and further disconnection between them and the players is the result. And this entire sequence of happenings leading to the eventual self-sabotage of the game can be traced all the way back to the one tiny little change that seemed harmless, which only had the intention to make the gameplay that little bit smoother. That one tiny change set the snowball rolling. This is what happens when one does not properly understand and consider each element's meaning toward a gameplay experience, even that as simple as walking or sprinting. And that lacking understanding can be a consequence of not having a solid idea of what you want your experience to be. Know your idea, understand its nuances, ensure players have adequate understanding of your intent through whatever means you see fit so that you're not led astray. Keep them informed and up to date. If you as a game maker are in a position that is relying upon the audience to steer the direction of development, then that is already a troublesome sign, unless the game's premise is somehow primarily based upon community involvement to steer it, and you hopefully wouldn't use that same notion as an excuse for lacking vision. Too many cooks spoil the broth. An old saying you may have heard before. It is very relevant here. You should be confident enough to know what is best for your end goal. Confident enough to know that oftentimes people do not know that something is good for them until forced to engage with it properly, even though they would sometimes fight against this notion to the bitter end. Confident enough to maybe seem arrogant in the eyes of others. It is worth taking that hit. But not arrogant so that you're unable to recognize and consider a genuinely good change or addition that you didn't conceive yourself, and be able to experiment without losing sight of your end vision. Thirdly, in reference to communication with players, you cannot expect them to understand the development process from your perspective if you make no effort to be transparent with them about what's going on. So, you've no right holding that against them in cases of criticism. As I make this video, there can be an observable distance between the game makers and the game players, in that during discourse via a public forum related to a game, for example, there is often a clear divide in understandings between both parties, and an overall lack of communication. In spite of all the claims to the contrary, the average player, to even a dedicated hobbyist, appears to know little to nothing in regard to the true technical workings behind what makes a game function. It remains a mystery to most, including myself. Players only know the end result, and are in the habits of frequently posturing and spouting hyperbole and ignorant assumptions as fact, often without any mind to be convinced otherwise on account of how much our communication etiquette has degraded. Constant conjecture being pushed as fact as an automatic defensive move against the criticism they expect and fear. They're only truly aware a said function can be done, and has been done before in a certain way, and wonders, if they're complaining, why it isn't being done to a standard they know already can be achieved. This can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you take everyone's word with openness, goodwill, and hope. In spite of the communication issues we face as a society, and certainly need to be retrained on, this resulting behavior is still not the player's fault. The severely lacking transparency from the gaming industry into the inner workings of development can only lead to the aforementioned result. In a time where players are now normalized into paying with their own money to alpha and beta test a game, exploiting their passion for the hobby for your own benefit and exposure, this lack of transparency is unacceptable for these circumstances, and disrespectful for both your creation's integrity and potential, and those who choose to give their own time and energy engaging with it, of which you should be very privileged and humbled for. Gaining someone's time, attention, and affection in a world that is already so taxing on these emotional resources is not something that should be taken lightly. And only through proper transparency and openness of what's going on can you hope to have those sentiments reciprocated through understanding of one another over time. Fourth and finally, external PR companies, or internal PR in the case of big publishers, in their current forms are utterly toxic and anti-consumer, anti-long-term, anti-morality. Avoid them like the plague if you can. Their sole objective is to exploit and manipulate the weakest psychological elements of a potential consumer by encouraging you to steer your game in a direction to take advantage of said weaknesses. Manufacturing hype, false advertising, fear of missing out mechanics, limited time offers in a format where limitation of availability is impossible, features that pry on addictive personalities, mechanics that compromise the core vision in favor of vapid progression features which make no sense for your game. They will push you toward these features constantly in order to get as much ammunition to enable their exploitation tactics, and will attempt to reassure you it's the best and only way. Players love this. If you don't have it in your game, you're going to struggle. You're going to need to give us more to work with. Players want this and that. Trust us, we know. Stay away from them if you can, and if you have to use them, don't let them dictate any aspect of how your game is made. They will only sabotage the integrity of your creation in the long term. Please don't forget your game's potential ability to enable us all toward increasing competency, so we may in the future enjoy an ever-increasing base standard of experiences that we presently could only dream of. I once again cannot understate the importance that your game may have on the development of so many lives. With such a responsibility to hand, it is your duty as those with this power of influence to ensure that we're given the appropriate challenge and trust to grow. We players may resist the unfamiliar or uncomfortable and label it as broken in our closed arrogance. We may reject and condemn that which requires new demands of us as being unintuitive. We may dismiss a game because it doesn't play the same as the other game we like. The first steps are always the hardest, especially if those new steps are to be taken inadequately informed. But once we break through those first steps of resistance with a reasonable chance and communication, we will be all the better for it and eventually grateful. And so the possibilities of the medium and our minds continue to grow, with yourselves being direct contributors to this. Don't lose heart if you face resistance. Stay your course through the storms. And if your foundations are solid enough, and hopefully with help from this guide, you will break through the turbulence with everyone in tow, with the next horizon of gameplay interaction possibilities waiting to be explored. Challenge us, push us, teach us. We need it. The industry needs it.